Welcome back to Nurau Talks, where every Friday at noon we discuss topics on mental health at the workplace with experts in the field. And I hope all of you had a good summer vacation. I know we've been taking a break for a couple of weeks, but today I'm back with Dr. Michelle Barton, who's here to talk to us about organizational resilience and relational pauses. So welcome, Dr. Barton, to our Nurau Talks.
I'm delighted to be here.
Wonderful. Dr. Barton, she is an associate professor at the Hopkins Carey Business School with expertise in organizational and team resilience, managing uncertainty and interpersonal effectiveness during adversity. Drawing from contexts such as wildland firefighting, high-tech entrepreneurship, and expedition racing, her research considers how groups make sense of ambiguous situations, how they coordinate, learn, and share knowledge in the midst of confusion, and how they mitigate and recover from adversity. She is especially focused on the relational dynamics that enable those practices. Dr. Barton's research has appeared in many academic and practitioner journals like the Harvard Business Review, the MIT Sloan Management Review, and she's presented her work at venues such as NASA, the U.S. Army, Medical Command, the Johns Hopkins University Patient Safety Conference, and Boston Medical Center, among others. Prior to her academic career, Dr. Barton was a co-founder of Harvard Business Publishing's eLearning business, where she was the global product director for leadership and management development programs. She has a BA from Pomona College and a PhD from the University of Michigan. So great to have you, Dr. Barton. That's a lot to read through. You've had a lot of experience in business and working with organizations, and I'm so excited to hear about what you have to share with us with regards to how organizations can be doing better. But first of all, maybe to put your research in context, I'd love to hear what group relations theory is. That's what your research is about, and so could you give us maybe a short definition of what group relations theory is?
Sure. It's group relations theory is actually kind of a combination of a lot of different areas, social psychology and psychoanalytics and so forth. But essentially what it is a theory that explores how subconscious tensions and anxiety impact group behavior. So it's trying to explain why groups sometimes behave in ways that just don't seem very rational or even in their best interests. And it focuses a lot on how we deal with anxiety in groups and how the way that we deal with anxiety, the behaviors that arise from that can get kind of embedded into group routines and structures over time.
Mm-hmm. So looking at how anxiety affects teams and I guess how that you talk a lot in your work about resilient versus non-resilient teams and how they respond to anxiety. So maybe could you talk a bit about what differentiates then a resilient team from a non-resilient or brittle team, and what are some of those factors that lead to a team becoming one or the other?
Sure. So there are a lot of things that resilience teams actually that sort of brittle teams don't do. Resilient teams are better able to improvise, so they recombine their skills really quickly or resources really quickly so they can adapt. They learn fast, they can learn on the fly even as things are unfolding and so forth. But the key here is that to do any of those things, they have to be able to work well together under conditions of stress and anxiety. And this was where this kind of gets at the heart of my work, because the difference between a resilient team and a brittle team, in my mind, at least to some extent, is how they deal with what I think of as the paradox of group resilience. And that is, when we face adversity in general creates anxiety, it creates stress, it creates fear and shame and all sorts of negative emotions, which for simplicity's sake, I'm just going to call sort of anxiety, right? We'll just call that sort of the umbrella term for all those negative emotions that arise. And if you think about your own experience with anxiety, it doesn't necessarily bring out the best in team behavior, right? Anxiety tends to trigger defense mechanisms. Humans don't actually like the feeling of anxiety, so we'll go to quite a few lengths to avoid it. And those defense mechanisms undermine the way that we work with one another. So the paradox is that the very situations that require us to really pull together, right? Adverse situations, crises, trauma, tend to, by their very nature, tear us apart. So just when we most need resilience, we tend to sort of instinctively go towards behaviors that are really undermining of good group behavior. So let me just start. So the difference, I think, between resilient teams and brittle teams are how they deal with that paradox. And it might help to shall I give an example of
Yeah, I think an example would be great, actually.
Because this is a story one of my colleagues actually encountered, and I think it's a great example of how anxiety can really tear a team apart. So this story starts with, it was a surgical group in a hospital, and it starts with a horrible mistake where a surgeon actually removed the wrong organ from a patient, right? So catastrophic error. And after this, the hospital administration insisted that staff not talk about it, not talk about the incident, probably for good, well-meaning reasons. But this error really struck at the heart of who people are on that surgical team and their identity as a place where people come to be healed. And the members of this team were just overwhelmed with, as you can imagine, feelings of grief, anger, and shame and fear. And so in a kind of unconscious effort to reduce the experience of that, to kind of step away from those emotions, they engaged in a lot of defense mechanisms. They try to sort of project those emotions. This is where we get into sort of the nitty-gritty psychology of it. But essentially what we do under those conditions is we try to kind of project those emotions away from us and onto other people. Like, you carry this, not me, right? And again, subconsciously. And so they did things like they treated the nurse manager as corrupt, and the offending surgeon was just incompetent, and the surgical nurse is a victim. And you'll notice those are really overly simplified labels for people. And over time, as they kind of enacted these labels, the nurses and surgeons came to see each other as enemies. And there were these sort of dysfunctional fault lines between these different roles in the group, to the point where people could no longer actually coordinate work. And in fact, the hospital had to cancel all the elective surgeries.
Wow.
So that's the example of how you can just tear a team apart.
Mm-hmm. Wow. And was there any intervention in that team, or like what was the end story with that team?
So unfortunately, there was no that was the story of that team.
Wow.
But they could have done something differently, right? So that's an example of a really brittle team. But the difference between that kind of reaction and a resilient team is how people in that team think about and deal with the anxiety that arises from those kinds of events. So a resilient team, for example, instead of turning away from one another, they turn towards one another in the face of adversity. And importantly, they turn towards one another to actually deal with the emotional fallout of that event, rather than sort of defend against negative emotions. They're actually come together to say, let's grapple with these negative emotions.
Right.
So one way to do that is through what I call a relational pause.
Yeah, that's great. It leads me on to my very next question, actually, Dr. Barton, which is, you talked a lot about relational pauses in your research. What is a relational pause? And talk a bit about why it's important in building a resilient team.
Yeah. So a relational pause is kind of a tool that teams can use to both deal with adversity in the moment, but also to build their resilience over time. So let me just define it first. It's a shift in the collective focus of the team from what they're doing to how they're relating. And importantly, how they're relating with respect to the emotions that they're experiencing. So it's kind of an explicit attempt to surface and acknowledge the realities of emotion at work, right? How is our work actually affecting us as humans? And how are we dealing with that anxiety? So the way it works is it often starts with a kind of a timeout. So, lots of teams take times, they'll do like medical teams will do a huddle, get together and say, okay, before we do this surgical event, which incidentally, they probably should have done in that environment, what are we doing? Who are we here? What are our assumptions and so forth? Military teams will do sort of a tactical pause sometimes. So there's lots of ways that teams do this, but for a relational pause, the point is you're taking a time out to grapple with emotion. So it usually starts with someone literally calling a timeout, saying, hey, we need to stop and talk about what's happening here, or what just happened, maybe after the fact. So that's sort of the first step of relational pause, is to take that pause and to shift. The second step is to actually ask people to share what they're experiencing. So members share with one another the story of what's happening to them. And this doesn't have to be some sort of deep psychoanalyst, kind of approach. It's not psychotherapy. But it is just telling your story. For example, in the surgical team, if they had acknowledged that this error wounded all of them, not just some of them, they could have opened up to one another and talked about what was it like to be in the room when this error happened, right? What was it like to be outside the room and experience the emotional fallout? And in those conversations, in sharing, here's what happened to me, here's how I experienced it, here's what I'm feeling and going through, the sadness and guilt and anger and all of that gets named and shared rather than hidden and defended against. And that's really important, because we can't, if we don't name and share and grapple with those emotions, then instead we go into this method of kind of defending against them, which leads to all this bad behavior, right, that breaks teams apart. That's sort of the main part of a relational pause, is having those conversations, showing, while people are speaking, other members need to be listening, showing compassion, which means things like acknowledging the reality of other people's emotions, even if they're not the emotions you had. Right? Maybe you're angry, but I'm scared. That doesn't mean one of us is wrong and the other is right. Those are real emotions. So acknowledging as once that happens, once those stories are shared and discussed and processed together, teams can move to the third step of a relational pause, which is to get to more of the problem-solving piece of, well, how is this impacting us? What are we doing? Am I kind of avoiding talking to you? Are we no longer, am I so worried about my own, danger in my job that maybe I'm going to stop sharing information? How's it impacting our behavior? And what could we be doing differently about that? So that's when you get to the stage of kind of repairing the way that we're relating to one another and creating new ways of interacting.
Yeah, it's really interesting, those steps, in terms of just taking a step back and providing a space where people can reflect on how they're feeling, instead of kind of just moving forward and everyone defending themselves. And it got me thinking about whether or not we should be doing this only in terms of crisis, or do you think that relational pauses should be a preventative measure? And kind of as a last question, I guess, what on a practical note would you suggest for workplaces? How can they integrate this into a more constant rhythm?
Yeah. 100%. I think it should be used as a preventative measure, because what you're doing with this is you're setting up a couple of routines. And I actually see this as being a really big distinction between resilient and non-resilient teams. One is that you as a team are getting into the habit of saying, distress belongs to all of us. It's not your problem. I mean, you're reacting to this your way and you're reacting to it that way. And you're just a problem person, always whining, whatever. We are a team. And just as how what we do affects one another, what we feel affects one another. So that distress or strain belongs to all of us. And once you think of it as belonging to you as a team, then you can start grappling with it as a team. So I think that's one really important distinction that you're building over time by doing these relational pauses regularly. It also builds a culture in which we can talk about emotion. Emotion is a very real part of our work life. And trying to deny the emotional reality of work it's as I've said before, it's like denying an accounting error. It's not going to go away, and it's certainly not going to help you solve any problems. It's all very real. So I think that teams can make relational pauses part of their routine. I've seen groups do this where they'll start or end a meeting with a relational pause. Hey, how's everyone doing? tell me how you're feeling this week. Tell me what's going on. Oh my gosh, I had the most amazing interaction with a customer. It was so stressful. Let me tell you whatever. And just getting in the habit of being able to talk together as a team about emotions means that when you do face a crisis or something more significant, you have the skills and the tools to grapple with it.
Right. That's what you said about prevention. I think that's exactly what we at Nurau really stand for. It's how do we embed psychoeducation in these kind of space for emotions in regular team meetings. And so thank you so much, Dr. Barton, for really expressing that so beautifully and clearly for our audience today. And I'm sure all of us are, just inspired to think about how we can be incorporating such relational pauses in our workplace as well.
My pleasure.
Thanks again, Dr. Barton. And for all of you out there, if you'd like to read Dr. Barton's work, her papers are on group resilience, are very well written, and you can definitely check her out on LinkedIn. We hope to see you again for the next LinkedIn Live.